see how far we get. It's a bit of a strange subject for me because it's about Baptist principles. Or how do you think? It's about Baptist principles, but we do a book on history. So, can you see how they relate? Because God doesn't work without life. He doesn't work without things happening. And you cannot just walk around with a lot of knowledge, but you cannot live it, then it is worthless. So it is His story playing out with people. So in the story, you learn the principles of God. And actually, we say it's Baptist principles. That's because the history, the line that we are following is that one, but it's actually His story. History is story. So I think we can look at what we're doing out of that perspective. It makes sense because principles happen in a story. The two is linked together. The fact without application is you have all the facts, but you don't apply it while you have it. So we're going to apply it through the discussion, see how people applied it through history.
I want to be a servant of Christianity.
Sure. Yeah. And I can testify from the mission field. I'm involved in the mission field 23 years now in Mozambique. So we are looking for people with a little bit of background also, who studied a bit, who said there's something burning in you, so you've done something with it.
Yeah.
You're not going directly to people and just say, without doing any effort on your own.
Yeah.
You're creating the knowledge and the circumstances for being used.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's we need people like that. Otherwise, your message is sometimes superficial.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason is we want to apply knowledge from the Bible and being church and everything that's necessary to see what will help us helping people to know God. And sometimes we need to know something about church. We need to know how does it work in the material life outside, and in the arts and in the agriculture and everywhere, and then apply it to help people to find God. So I need to just talk about this also, I think, because then we are more or less on the same page when we go through this. It helps that we can have a feeling for one another also. My background, I studied theology in Stellenbosch, and then after that I finished in 93, November, December, and then 1st January 94 we went over the border, me and my wife, to Mozambique, in a war-torn country with only a lot of zeal in your heart, without knowing what you're going to do and how you're going to do. I've made a lot of mistakes. My studies didn't help me much in knowing cultures, understanding, really loving people in practice. They gave me a lot of information which helped, but the real things I had to learn on the field, in practical life, applying it, making a lot of mistakes. After 10 years, I looked back at my ministry and I said, maybe I did more wrong than right. And I had to start all over again. And then the Lord challenged me, and I said, I need to explain Jesus in a different way to people. But do I know Him well enough to do that? And I said, no, I don't. I decided to do for him again. And then go on. So, we cannot talk about the facts without the applying. That's why principles come to history. Why should we learn about history and denominations? Of different denominations. Why should we study it? I'm asking quite a few questions and feel free to participate.
So most of them are not going to be rhetorical.
No. I don't think that, but rhetorical questions. Why do we study the history of denominations? Not only the Baptist.
To see how much hurt there can happen to people. Misunderstand each other without thinking.
The hurts that happens, and we don't want to do it again and again and again.
Yeah, that's generally. I normally try to look back and say, okay, don't make the same mistakes.
Yeah,
and find people still make the same mistakes. So,
not to make the same
but
mistakes.
not to make the same mistakes.
The Bible says that what happens will happen again. So history repeats itself.
And the nature of people is still the same. There's still the desire to the wrong side in every person.
And I think as the average person underestimates the strange things other people are capable of.
That's right. I think that's a very, very good point. People reacted in the past, and how you are misleaded in the past sometimes, and why. So, with that in your mind, you can see things happening clearer in what is going on today.
What fascinated me most with the subject I did before this one was the Reformation and more history around that.
That's where we're going to start.
Yeah. And what fascinated me was the people God used.
Exactly.
That fascinated me because they weren't perfect.
Exactly.
And I think the other thing that's wonderful about history, especially if you're looking at it from a believing perspective, is that it's not all just random events. Far behind the story, there's a greater power leading it towards a moral and a line of sense. It's like reading a story, but knowing that the presence of God is always there. And that also gives you a sense of peace in this world that's so confusing sometimes.
God is always there. And yes, there are a lot of things going wrong if we don't understand it. But God is always there. And some beautiful things also happen as signs of God's presence in the history. His involvement and his love for people. You can still see that. History, and it shows us also that our history is not perfect. There's a lot of mistakes, and we will still make mistakes here. And we're talking about history and how God works through history and why it's important to look at history and to see the principles through which God works. That we can see, as we're talking about now, history is not perfect. There's a lot of mistakes. It's not something to be proud of. We cannot be proud of our denominations or anything other than God. Because we're coming from a broken history, we are in a broken history, and sometimes God is using people in this history, and the way that He used them It's what we see and get ideas of in the history. With places where you don't expect it, and through the people you don't expect it, and in the type of situation and circumstances like in business or in art or in politics, sometimes things happen. And how God uses all of this, it's about Him. It's not about our stories, it's about His story. And we are writing the history of tomorrow. God is writing His story through us. And we can grow from the past to the future. That's the ability of the image of God that He gave us. So we can make decisions to improve on the history. Because God is writing it through us. We don't have the capacity. We cannot even love someone else. We are not able to do that.
That's right.
But He can do it through us. So it is all about a history that we are writing in relationship with God. So, and we can see how in the history many people started focusing on denomination or on people or on situations and not living out of their relationship with God and making just more and more mistakes. So we learn from their mistakes, and then we can see people who've done amazing things. And at the end will tell you, mostly all of them will tell you it's not me doing it, it's God. Then you get the other one, you get proud. There's pride in his life because of what happened. Instead of, he's taking the honor instead of giving it to God. He's still again, not again, through the relationship of God. He's himself starting to do it. And then he starts to make mistakes. These things you see in the history. So that opens doors for today to do it differently, to grow from it. So, will the brokenness we see in history of denominations end somewhere?
Repeat the question.
Will the brokenness of denominations, all these mistakes they made, will it end somewhere?
It depends on your eschatology.
Don't say things I don't understand. Will the brokenness end here on earth?
Definitely.
When Jesus comes back.
When He comes back.
When it comes to restore.
But will it in our human...
No.
Brokenness will always be with us. Because that's what we've done to ourselves. And that is always with us till Jesus comes. And then He said our salvation will be complete. Yes. Then there will be no tears and no etc. But while we are here, the brokenness, the suffering, and the sacrifices that we will see in history will continue. And the more we can sacrifice, that's what history teaches us. The more we can sacrifice, the more we can honor God. The more we can live unselfish, dying ourselves, the more you see God in people, and we will see it throughout history. Amazing stories. So, can all lessons learned in the past be applied on the denomination of today?
Can
all lessons in the past that we learned through these, can we apply it just like that today?
It's difficult because we can apply about the mistakes that they made and then we can correct it today.
Yes, you've learned the lesson there.
And then I can apply correcting the mistake they made.
And apply it the same way they applied it.
Yeah. Not the same way they applied it.
Ah.
Because they just say if they were like mistakes, I'm not going to do the same mistakes.
Yes.
But then there might be something very important that I should apply also today.
Yes. That's very important.
Yeah.
Because that's a point I want to get to us to think also. When we are busy with the history, there are certain circumstances and factors that we don't even think of that made people doing things a certain way.
Culture.
But it's not to say that God, in our situation, with our technology, in our circumstances, and our transport and communication, that's a totally different world.
That is. Yeah.
So you learn from the history, but you need to go to the principles, and the application of the principle may be the same sometimes, but mostly will be different. So there's not strict rules we can get from the past and apply the same way. There's principles in the past that we know is the truth that we can apply today. But we need to love the people enough so that we can understand them before us and the people that we are working with, so that we apply it the way that will work for them. Otherwise it's useless. If you don't love people enough so you have that real interest in their lives, understanding their problems of today, then we can apply it in their lives and help them to discover the principle how to apply it in their lives with God. But it's different. You cannot say, because that's a mistake that we make in the history. Over and over again. We take a certain structure, you take that structure and you plug it for today. It doesn't work that way. People change. You don't love them because you didn't start with understanding them, so that you can apply it in a different way that works. In the past, people had more time. For example, you can have hours and hours of meetings. Today you have to think again. How will you communicate personal, relational principles to one another, but the timing is different? How do you do it? I don't have all the answers, but it can't be the same. You need to adapt some things to apply. And we cannot take the church structure of the past and just apply it to today. So we need to look at the principles and then not at exactly how they applied it, understand how they applied it and why, as far as possible, but see how we apply it today. So I'm interested in the history because of these principles that we can take from it. Okay, times have changed. Why should we tell about the mistakes of the past? Why should we tell people about the mistakes of the past? Sometimes we need to communicate also the mistakes of the past. I mean, that is, it's clear, it's because we are not proud. We don't tell history to be proud of our history. Because I don't think we can be. We tell history with mistakes because we show God's mercy in it. So we need to show our brokenness also. Because you get some history writers that only, even missionaries, when they come back telling the stories, they tell only the good stories. But the good stories is not always giving the honor to God. It's actually in the bad stories you discover God's grace sometimes much deeper than in the good stories. Because you need Him more. Yeah, if you understand what I mean. It's a life story that we are looking into what happens in the life of humans. Human history is always messy and full of mistakes, but also God's truth and grace shines through at places. But we always tend to mess it up.
So true.
Yeah, but be honest and tell everything. We don't trust in the human institutions, we trust in God. Not trusting in denomination, but we use the domination and what the domination are telling us about God to help other people. But we don't trust in the denomination. The denomination is only a pathway. It is not the object. And I think we can learn that through history many times.
Yes.
Where the church became the object and the reason for working, we must go. It's not the church is only the channel through which God works. And it should never take any honor. It's God who takes the honor. Otherwise we steal it from Him. His honor we take it for ourselves. If a denomination is not doing this, it is not helping us, but destroying us. If a denomination is not giving honor to God, it's not helping the people, it's destroying the people. Because it's misleading the people. That happens in the history over and over again. Pride. We do the things for the denomination or the structure, and at the end, it destroys us. Okay, then, if we start now with the history I would like us to start with the times around the 16th century. In the book, and in any case, we start there. What does the word Protestant mean? Yeah. We are Protestants, all of us.
It is to protest against the erroneous ways of doing things that was apparent in the main churches of that time frame.
Okay. Protest against what happened wrongly in church, like the church becoming more important than God, because we like people to come to the church and not in the first place to God.
And bending the faith, basically.
Yeah, just one example of a mistake that took place in many denominations.
And it's still taking place.
Yeah.
I think also the Protestant movement, because they started realizing that there was something wrong, they developed a small structure of how to guide themselves, and I think this might be for in a moment or two later, but the five solas is quite a role in the Protestant worldview.
Very, very good. Because it was in the Catholic state-instituted church that were the government and the church in one, who functions in a certain way, and then in history the name Protestant came from the people who started protesting and said it's not right. Mostly in our days it's the prophets who say the relationship with God is not what it should be. You know that Ephesians talk about that there are prophet is one of the gifts of God. Some people are strong in it, others not so strong in it, but there are always people in a when they see the relationship with God is not what it should be, to start talking. They are the prophets. Well, that's from I can give you books and things about this, but this is how my summary of it. So, there were the people, the prophets, who protested against things that were not right. Can we mention some of the things that were not right? And we know about the 95 points on the door, but I mean, can we just for the most important ones? What is the things that you understand as the things that went wrong that had to change in that time?
The authority of the scriptures wasn't the authority
The authority of the scriptures, yep. Sola Scriptura. It's the Bible. It should be the only base of not the leadership of the church also, because the Pope and the others were writing laws with the same value than what the Bible said. And the Protestants say, no, that can't be. The Bible is the truth, not what you say.
I'm sure that and there also something of religion, which means like the church became more religious than the place of worship and worship. So that way those protesters, they said, no, this is the house of God. It's supposed not to be where we pretend like we are doing things of God, but it's other things that are taking place.
Your heart is not in it.
Yes, so I think.
Yeah, there were a lot of ceremonies and things happening which were not from God and not from a relationship in God. Like we know about the 7 sacraments that they had and all those things in that time. So many religious things that happens without the personal relationship of each member with God, which is important. I think that is one of the mistakes in today's church. We really have to look at it. It's one of the principles we can still look at.
Yeah, and what makes the Catholic Church interesting in a certain sense is that we sometimes say these are concepts that we're not supposed to do, but they usually literally made those mistakes and wrote down the rules in how to perform this mistake. There were steps that they placed between you and Christ before communicating with Christ. You had to convince Mary, his mother, to talk with him before you can come to Christ.
Yes.
You had to pray to saints to heal yourself. There were saints for different illnesses.
Even to forgive you.
Yeah. And forgiveness was something completely elusive. It was something completely out of reach. God was, in the Catholic worldview of that time frame, God was only gracious in the sense that grace existed, not in the sense that He actually gave it freely.
Sure.
You see, if you look at these things, it comes so into the heart of our relationship with God. It is so important. That's why if I talk about looking at the prophets, looking at the relationship of each member with God, it's in the heart of understanding your relationship with God. And if you don't live out of that relationship, but anything else, like church or trusting people and so on, then you miss something of that. I don't say you cannot trust people, but you trust people that are telling you who God is, and through the Bible, etc. And we need trust between people also, but at the end, they trusted people with their forgiveness. And you can't say that. So you can only trust to somebody to help you put your trust in Christ, not in them. So the church and its structure became important. And there's pride. And only the priest could understand the word. The members can't. So don't even give a Bible to a member. He will mess up the whole message. Only they're not allowed to read the Bible. So all of those things they protested. So and the Baptists started from out of that the Reformation. It's part of the Protestants who protested against these things. And the other thing is, when we start with the Reformation, to reform a church structure, it's easy to talk about it, but to do it, it's impossible for a human to do that. You need God's work in it. Because it's so difficult to change fixed structures. Actually, I've read a lot of books on how people investigating in our days, these days, how churches change their structures. And they said actually that you don't find it. It's not so easy. If you are in the wrong structure and the wrong thinking and the wrong fixed rules and regulations and doctrines, and to change that is nearly impossible. It doesn't happen. It happens when a congregation dies and starts all over again. But to change it is so difficult. It is God's work. And we will see in the Reformation how many people had to die, how many sacrifices had to be made to change something. And the Lord is asking us to change the world. So what do we learn?
That sacrifices will be necessary for that change to happen.
I'm getting people telling me, hey, but I'm suffering. And normally my answer is, don't worry, you will suffer more. Because that's reality. And we don't say it to one another anymore, but in the history you learn it, you can see it. That's how things happen. If you want to bring change, it costs a lot. And many had to die. And we will see that how it happened in history. And if you're not convinced, try it. And don't try it, we all are going to do it.
Some people still die.
But because we see the history, we are ready to die. That's where the power of God lays. Because that's what Jesus did. We are ready to die, and we're going to die, and we don't mind. We can have peace in our death and bring transformation. Because God asks us for transformation. The world can't stay like it is. And it's like in the Reformation, it changes, it's difficult. So that's just as an introduction. And if we can focus on these things about God and His relationship to us, the sacrifices that happens, the mistakes that we make, the humility we need to have in our accepting of our errors, but looking for God, I think the history will make a lot of sense. And we can get a lot of these principles out of it. The introduction in the book, I want to start with introduction, but I'm going to read small pieces and then we discuss it. Baptists are one of the largest Protestant groups, you see it's Protestant, in the world today, representing a total community of about 100 million people. Okay, just for 100 million people, what percentage is that of the world?
Extremely small.
Okay, it's a nice perspective to have.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people, but it's extremely small percentage of the world. It's a good perspective to have. The largest group of the Baptists is in the United States of America. The rest are scattered around nearly all the nations of the world. The history of these Baptist churches can be traced back to the few English Baptist churches established in London. We will look at the timeline just now. At the beginning of the 17th century. I think we're going to start with the timeline. If we talk about, just to make sure, if we talk about the beginning of the 17th century, what year is that more or less?
1601.
1601 more or less, yeah. So we start with 1600 because from 1600 started the... actually, I'm going to add another page on this side also, but let's start here where the book starts. The year 1600. In that verse in London. We're talking about the Baptist history. Okay. Those churches, however, were undoubtedly influenced by the Anabaptist movement of the 16th century. Now I'm going to... Before that, in the 16th century, that is starting from 1500, there were the Anabaptists. And we were going to Anabaptists. From them started the Baptists in London. This is the first Baptist churches, and we will see the year more clearly later on. What does the word Anabaptist stand for? Do you know?
Anabaptists, the Anna is just doing it again,
Rebaptized. Yes, that's right. So the Anabaptist, the word means they rebaptized on that stage where the Reformation started from the beginning of the 16th century. There was a Reformation, let's write it in here also. Well, just after the 15th century, there was a Reformation. And we know in the Reformation, the strong idea is baptizing children.
Was this in Switzerland?
Yes, actually Germany.
Germany.
Okay.
Was that under Zwingli?
Zwingli, yes. We will see where Zwingli sits in, but yeah.
Just
Luther and Calvin is normally the two church fathers of the Reformation that they call first. But in any case, we will talk about them in the history. And they do the children's baptism, and then started the Anabaptists, and they say, no, children is baptized, but we don't accept that. So we're working with that faith baptism. So when people confess their faith, they baptize them as adults. And that's why it's now a second baptism. And that is why Anabaptist, a rebaptism, a repeated baptism. And because its principles that came from the Reformation, and the Reformation, I don't know if we have to talk more about the Reformation. I think we have a good idea what happened in the Reformation. What was the changes that happened? It was totally new, the corruption of the human nature. They saw that the people are totally corrupted and always doing the wrong things. So you can't trust in people. Like the Roman Catholic Church trusted in the fathers and the priests and the Pope, etc. And then the role of the member is important, capacity to understand, and logic. So members need to know the Bible and read the Bible. The grace and salvation through Christ. very important points that changed. It's not the church that saved you, it is Jesus Christ. It's not through Maria or anything else or the religious acts that save you, it is only Jesus. Etc. And the role of the Bible, etc. And those churches in turn, that is now Anabaptist, were most probably influenced by the still earlier movements holding to some similar principles. We will begin our story with the Anabaptists in the 16th century, even though the direct spiritual descendants of the Anabaptists today are not the Baptists, but the Mennonites and Lutherites. They came from the Mennonites. Did you hear these words before?
I know about them.
I know about the Mennonites, but the Lutherites was new for me when I read this. I had to look it up again. But they came from the Anabaptists, actually. But we will see how it worked. Later on, we will put the whole timeline, maybe at the end of the course.
All timeline together.
It will keep a bigger picture for us so that we can just know where to fit in what. Okay, now the second part of the book is about the Anabaptists. The Reformation of the 16th century gave birth to a number of Protestant churches in Europe. Most of the reformers had led these churches believed it was necessary to work closely with the state authorities. And now we start to see issues. The relationship with state. I will write them in red. Because this relationship between church and state is one of the issues that caused a lot of problems and uncertainties. So that the Reformation of the church could proceed in a lawful and orderly way. You still want to go in a lawful, orderly way, being church. So you need to find a way, how do you relate now to the government? Because before the Reformation, you were the government. The church were the government, which were the same people. And now there's, with the Reformation, now there's a group going away from that system. And how will they now relate to the government? If they start their own kingdom, the government won't like it. So immediately from the government side, there's tension. So that became an issue. Well, how will you relate to the church now? And how will you do the things that God tells you, but the government don't agree with it? They don't like another kingdom there.
Yeah, can I say something?
Yes?
Because we live in a Western world where all these problems have been solved,
Not totally, but anyways.
yeah, not totally, but we don't know how it is to live in a world where the church and the state is one thing, and where the religious beliefs are completely determined and inspected by the government, and the members of the state is responsible to keep the religion intact. I think for us to understand that kind of worldview, we can go to the east and to countries like Iraq, and we might laugh at Iraq and we might laugh at Saudi Arabia, but that's basically where we were in the 15th century.
And the question is, did we do the right thing? Shouldn't we govern a country through God's principles. I'm not waiting, this is rhetorical.
Yeah. I know I did that one.
We can have a lot of ideas about it,
Mm.
but that's the nice thing about history.
Yeah.
We can start asking questions. What does the Lord want us to do? If we understood how things worked and the problems that were there. Because immediately there's a lot of things that you can say for a church government. Because there isn't a better way to guide a country through love principles of the Bible. Through the biblical stewardship of companies and all of those things. If you follow God's way of doing things, you are much more successful. And a lot of the development in the world was because of God's principles.
That's true.
So why should a government not use those principles and say, this is the way how we going to obey God? By putting Him as the King of our country. And we will serve the country through God's principles. You see, you can have a lot of cons and pros in a lot of, but now the problem is many people don't agree with you. What do you do with those people? Do you give them freedom for their own choices? Or do you tell them through the law what they need to do? There's a lot of questions we need to ask, but that's why history is so important. It can open our minds to other questions and things that we can ask God, what do we need to do for today? In any case.
Interesting enough, Israel basically was run as they were a government that's supposed to be governed by God. So for Israel, religion, but they were in captivity more than they actually had freedom.
Yeah, because of their own mistakes.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, so there's many questions that you through God's story in the Bible, etc. This issue can be a very interesting one. And that's why I start to love history more and more, put it that way. And you're not such a big fan.
A lot of question marks.
Sorry, my father. You were talking about, I think, sacrifice.
Yeah.
So that sacrifice we're talking about the sacrifice as a Christian or as a human being or as people of God or maybe let's just say citizen of the country or stuff like that toward God, or it was a sacrifice which God came to us. What kind of sacrifice
Both.
were you talking?
We are because He sacrificed, He said we will suffer with Him. And His suffering is because of the world. And we also suffer because of the world. Because we see many people and things that happen that is not biblical, when people do things that is actually hurting one another. And we say it can't be like that. And there are so many people who don't even know their Creator. Are confused about what is the Creator. And we don't want to leave it like that because we love them. And because we love them, we will do something about it and we will be persecuted for doing that. That's in history we learn that's what. And if there's congregations living a very comfortable life, something is wrong with what they're doing. Because if they really do something about what is not right in the world, they will not be that comfortable. But the history teaches us if we want to change something out of love for God and for people, you will suffer and you will have sacrifices. It's not through history, the Bible tells us it, but we can see it happening in history also. The truths of the Bible And in his story, there's the people who serve the Lord know that we're going to have some sacrifices to make. We have as Christians, and we don't really care. Because if you love something or somebody, you don't care sacrificing for it.
That's true.
Actually, you find peace in doing the right thing and fulfillment. Even if you have to sacrifice a lot, even die. I mean, that's normal to live in history. But that is, we work closely with the state authorities so that the reformation of the churches could proceed in lawful and orderly way. There were others, however, who believed that the state had no business interfering in church matters. You can see now the tensions. And the Christians should reform the churches themselves. It's not the government going to directly, according to the Word of God, as they understood. So that's the first issue, and we will just explain a little bit how it affected the first congregations after Reformation, the first denominations. I don't like to call them churches. You will see through my presentation. We are not really churches. We are denominations. We are not important. There's one church. And it's in all the denominations in any case. I don't like, we are denominations, and we need to act like a denomination, not the church.
God's denomination.
So, in any case, so I just wanted to conclude that, and it looks like okay. Now I think history can be very interesting. In any case, okay, we continue. So the first struggle they had is to find now a new relationship with state. In Zurich, for example, tensions developed between Zwingli, the leading reformer of that city. That is the one participating in the Reformation actively and in the city of Zurich. And some of his disciples, Zwingli felt that the right way was to preach the truth and wait for the city authorities to bring about the necessary reforms. So they want to preach, and through preaching convince the municipality or the people, the leaders of the government, to bring reforms because of their preaching. That's how he believed that that's the role of the Christians, or the denomination, or the group. Bring about the necessary reforms in church and society, and they became convinced as they become convinced of it. So he's just preaching. If they're not getting convinced of it, they will not bring the change. But that is, he don't want to force it, he just wants God maybe to work through them, through the preaching. Some of his friends, including Konrad Grebel and Franz Mans, felt that the process was too slow, and that the Christians must make changes immediately as they become convinced of their necessity, what is necessary. Because that's also normal. If you know what you need to do it. That's what they say. Start the change, even if it starts a revolt or what, it doesn't matter. You do what you're convinced of, what the Lord tells you. Don't wait. So then immediately there were tensions between the ones. That means Zwingli wanted to give people choices. And I think that's quite a principle. To say, I cannot tell you what to do. I want to convince you first, and then you do what the Lord tells you to do. Because that is long-term change. If you tell a person, do this and this, then they do it because of you, not because of their conviction. And when there's problems, they will fall back on the old ways. because they're not really convicted. So you understand that is, if you look further, they didn't write it, but you can see that. Differences between living through laws and living through conviction. You see the difference between living by laws and living through conviction. Very interesting. I said I've watched a YouTube video of a theologian that I really like, and he talked about Europe, and he talked about corruption and doing things the right way. For example, in Holland, when he went to buy milk, he went in there and there were nobody there. You can take the milk and then you have to put your money there in a basket and take your change and you go and nobody watches you. They trust the members of the community. They don't need anyone to sell it. So you save a lot of money. And if there's corruption, then you need to have laws. So you need lawmakers, you need police to police it, to apply it, and you need somebody to sell the milk. And at the end, you have to add the price of the milk. So at the end, you pay for a lot of things that is not milk. But if you trust one another and can work in trust, you don't need all those laws. You can just go in and you buy a milk at the price. And what's a more reasonable price? Just for interesting.
Very interesting. Don't try it in South Africa.
But
I can't bring my mind around that. I can't.
Yeah, and he was asking the question, how did Holland manage to build a community with such trust? It's biblical principles that were applied. You cannot do it today in Holland. That was quite a few years ago. Today it's terrible. You will not find your milk if you do it, all the money. Even in Holland it's changing. Tensions, well, that's just for interesting sake, but you can see Zwingli's conviction is let the people decide for themselves. We preach the truth. We are not in control of how we change as people. And there's something biblical in that also. God gave us choices. So there's something biblical in that. But there's also, if you are convinced of something, you do it. It's the other side. Tensions increased even more in the more radical reformers began to disagree with Zwingli about what changes were needed. They disagreed with him, for example, concerning the legitimacy of infant baptism. Now we'll get to the Baptist history. In 1325, you can start writing that down. 1525. Grebel, Mans and others took the decision to rebaptize themselves and from a voluntary congregation. There started rebaptism. Okay. It was their rejection of the infant baptism that gave them the name Anabaptists. So the Anabaptists started in 1525. What is a voluntary congregation? What is voluntary in that congregation?
Is it the membership that's voluntary? Or is it the things being done in the congregation that's voluntary?
I think both. I'm asking the question not knowing exactly, but I think it's an important word to what is a voluntary congregation? Why they call it a voluntary congregation? They don't explain it. but they didn't force people to be
there's no
baptized.
force. Yeah.
They didn't force people to be members. They didn't force anyone. They gave decision to the believer himself. They talk about their convictions, but they don't give them rules. They give them indications to make their own decisions. If you want to rebaptize, you can. But remember, it was not the easy decision in those days.
No.
Because what will happen if you rebaptize in that community of that time? Thinking back.
What's interesting is the whole theology around how they work that out. Because today we have, maybe we can say something a bit too complex, but today we have covenant theology, and people work the infant baptism around the covenant theology. But I'm not really even sure if they had covenant theology back in those days. What did they have?
Reformation started covenant theology. So they already had a little bit of that. I don't know how far
Yeah,
it
I
spread.
understood a bit of it.
But the reformers, the Protestants, that's one of their identity is the covenant. At that time it was worse.
Yeah.
If you rebaptize yourself, you actually are, like call it, you are nothing. You are cursed. You are evil.
Yeah,
Because you are changing something that people don't believe in, and therefore you are their problem. So the best way they can handle it is to tell you are bad so that they feel better.
But in a way, as far as heresy, and for heresy,
that's the word I mean.
heresy was a punishment of death.
Exactly.
They would burn you.
It's serious.
The thing is, they saw baptism as the initiation into the church community. They saw themselves as a called out community, and that you became part of that community via baptism. And so by rejecting your infant baptism, you're rejecting everything in the community and what it stands for. That's how they understood it. So when these people started baptizing themselves again, they were considered people who are rejecting the whole worldview.
Okay. Now that's what mine is now. I always saw them as more Calvinistic than
Or Calvinist.
Calvinist.
So, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, but the membership in South Africa of the Dutch Reformed Church, they don't necessarily understand the 5 points of Calvinism.
How many people do they do?
Can you give us that 5 points?
There are 5.
Pillars of Calvinism.
You mentioned it.
Yes, I can give you the 5 points of Calvinism.
Can you give it to us again?
Okay,
Just
the I remember it according to the acronym. The acronym says TULIP. So it's T for total depravity, U for unconditional election, L for limited atonement, I for irresistible grace, and P for perseverance of the saints.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't remember it better.
Well done.
Okay, that's what the Reformation stands for. Anyways, so now many other Baptists, they also rejected the idea of state church. The Anabaptists say it's not, you cannot be state and church.
No, I agree.
And believe that only convinced believers should be baptized. Only those who are convinced. We talked about you giving them their choice, and they need to be convinced, because then it's from their heart. And that's a very important thing. And that the local churches should consist only of such believers, gathering together freely under the lordship of Jesus Christ and the authority of the Holy Scriptures.
I think they call that the believer's baptism today.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so that's the believer's baptism.
Yes.
Okay.
So we can now tell our principles that we can get our own principles from what happened here. But I mean, there's not always clear answers to this is the truth and that is a lie. You can see state. There's something to say also for a state and church working together. You can also say, I mean, you cannot be state if you are church. Both sides you have a lot of pros and cons. And if you go into a study into this, you will find more influences and pros and cons that you ever thought, didn't even think of now. So it's not about this is the truth and this is a lie. The history is about how did people handle it? Because we need to handle it today again. In a different environment. Many other Anabaptist groups sprang up in different parts of Europe, such as South Germany, while Balthasar Hoopmeyer and Hans Dens were leaders. The term Anabaptist was applied rather generally to the wide variety of groups, some of them holding for extreme and heretical views. So there are some of those groups that gone way wide. But the whole group, all of those different groups that they call Anabaptists. Heretical, we know what that means. Going against holding opinion and at odds with the general accepted doctrine. If you go going against the general accepted, the community evaluate you as a heretic. But I mean that's not always what God says about you. But that's what.
I think a heretic in God's eyes is somebody who denies who Jesus is.
Even denied his grace. In the city of Münster, for example, a group of Anabaptists gained control of the city. A man named John Matthias became leader, claiming he was the Enoch who should prepare the way for Christ by establishing a community of goods and doing away with all law codes. That's one of them. That's the history. There will always be these groups, but there's no laws.
And no law from God, nothing. You can do what you want.
So there's no structure, there's no laws.
Okay.
So you wouldn't be laws, these laws.
It should be a very chaotic.
Chaotic.
But it probably taught some kind of sense of morality that should be led by the Spirit or something.
Yeah, I think that's what we mean with community of goods.
Yeah.
Actually, of good things, I believe, for doing good things. So you see, you've got the general idea of the time of the Anabaptists, with the different groups in Europe and so on. The ungodly, who would not submit to rebaptism, had to flee or be slaughtered. If you don't want to receive the second baptism, you are slaughtered, killed, or you have to flee somewhere where they can't find you. What do you do with those? Because then that brings questions into the mind about our convictions. What do you do with those with different convictions than you? They decided to kill them. If you see somebody who don't believe in God.
So then again, where's the love?
Yeah, well,
You start with
how do we,
the love.
and that is the balance again. How do you, as Ephesians 4 say, live in truth and in love?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, at that time, during that culture, during that time period, that was what they did. But think about it. If you're doing that today and you don't like what that person talks about or what they follow, you're cutting off as a person either way, so they're still dead. I mean, you don't talk to him, so there's a...
Yes.
You know, if killing was allowed, we probably would do it. I mean, let's be honest.
I think we can write again heresy as one of the heresy. You don't spell it that way, no? I don't know. And then the baptism. I just want to write in red the issues of that time, because that helps us to keep it together. And the Reformation, we know, I'm not going into that because that's a bit further. The Anabaptists of Münster were eventually defeated by their enemies. And the whole incident gave Anabaptists a very bad name among Protestants and Catholics who persecuted them severely. Thousands of peace-loving Anabaptists all over Europe were martyred by the other Protestants, killing them because of this heresy that they are living out like John. So from both sides, they were. We would call it not. We say there's no love between them. But we need also to understand the situation of that time. Killing people had a different value.
The punishment the government instituted didn't always reflect the personal relationships that the people had. So just because the government said that a person should be executed as a wrongdoer didn't mean that everybody in the government necessarily felt that person was a bad person per se, and that they won't be able to talk to them or maybe convince them. It was more a sense of they've done something that deserves death. Now we're giving them punishment that they deserve. So they're just executing justice, not really thinking further about the matter, because they're being obedient to God by executing the justice in that way, which is blind, but it's a whole different world.
Yeah, and I wonder what Zwingli's reaction maybe were, because he's the one who giving choices to people. So you will decide for yourself. So I don't know what was his stance of people at the end about people who rebaptized themselves. I don't know. But that's interesting.
I think what's interesting about Zwingli is he really enjoyed discovering the new things inside the Bible. And so when he started encouraging other people to form small groups and start studying the Bible on your own, because he had pleasant experiences doing the same thing. After he encouraged them to do it, they started doing it themselves. And they started discovering things that he would never have thought of. And I think that rocked his boat just too much. That somebody else can discover something that he never thought of. And
I don't know what was his reaction. I don't know. But it's interesting. I myself is totally convicted with intercultural work and working from the mind frame of giving people choices.
Yes.
Because I want people to grow in their own leadership and their own choices, and their own relationship to God should be important.
pretty much my stance as well on the subject of evangelism.
And allowing them to make wrong decisions also. It's hard sometimes. It's really hard.
I believe if the person really believes that maybe in the future somewhere the wrong decision will open up, God will open up something to that person that, can change his heart. That's possible. He can make a wrong decision now, and I mean a lot of us made wrong decisions in the past. And somewhere along the line you realize, whoa. But here, the knowledge I had was wrong. Personally, I had that experience in a biblical concept where I realized, wow, but I was wrong there, and I went back to the people and I told them, listen, because I didn't know this, I was wrong. The real is this, and you must be able to do it, even if you are a qualified doctorate. If you are wrong and you find out you're wrong, go back to the people and tell them the truth.
Yeah.
That is the main thing.
And then the working out of your own brokenness also.
Yes.
The mistakes, accepting your mistakes. That's not the easy thing.
Yeah.
That's really hard to die in yourself.
The thing is, I just, one of the biggest things that God gave man is the fact that he can choose.
Yeah.
That's the whole story of the garden. They had a choice.
You had the choice.
So, what's changed about that?
And I love to tell people in Mozambique also to do the creation. Because they have the idea sometimes that it's a woman's mistake. It's not theirs as men. And then I asked them, did Adam have a choice or not?
Yes.
And then as soon as they say yes, then he made a mistake.
Yeah, because the covenant was made actually with Adam and not with Eve. That was God's covenant. We discussed that already. Yeah.
Most of the descendants of the Anabaptists today are called Mennonites, or after Menus Simons. Do you know the Mennonites? Something about them?
I know a few things, not enough for me to illustrate them.
They're mostly in America. At the end, where they still function today.
Yeah.
But they are against technology.
Yeah, no, that I know.
So they are still on horses, doing not cell phones or any technology.
Yeah, I think some of those groups also like communism. They try to share things among each other.
Not like the communists on another way, but
yeah.
I was going to share that earlier on. I mean, like the state and church thing. I mean, communism is pretty much the same thing. It was run properly.
Yeah, there's a lot of good things in communism.
Yeah, it's been a good thing.
So the Mennonites, they still there in America. And then the other group, after important Anabaptist leader, and another important Anabaptist leader was Jacob Latter. The group influenced by him became known as the Rights. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, the Rights or the Rights, I don't know. Many of them lived in special Christian communities where they practiced common ownership of goods, communism, as you say. Okay, so we have that more or less this coming from the Anabaptists. We understand their situation and now going to them also. Common in most Anabaptists was the conviction that the church is a voluntary association of Christians who have confessed their faith in Christ through believers' baptism. So, voluntary, and you accept it through baptism, and have bound themselves together to live obedience to Jesus Christ and the commandments. They bound themselves, so there's something of the law also, telling them these are the rules in obedience of Christ. Thus they reject the idea of a state church and the practice of infant baptism. They also reject the use of war and violence as a means of solving social and political problems. Also like how the heretics did by killing people who didn't baptize themselves.
Okay, so for interstate problems between countries, they agree with war.
That's an interesting question.
Is that say again?
We're saying they, as far as I know, they would say that they're complete pacifists.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's more than just political and social, it also includes all forms of war.
I believe that. That's what I
Yeah.
understand through what I said.
Violence and, yeah.
They're pacifists.
Yeah.
You don't kill anyone in any circumstances.
Yeah.
Their descendants number about 800,000 today and are known mostly in the name of Mennonites. Mennonites. Great, so well, today that's part of the picture. Okay.
That's another thing of the Amish. It was like some of the Amish.
Amish, yes, that it is Amish.
It's the Amish.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I figured. All right. That's the only group I know that today. It's like still back then.
Yeah. The Amish is a subdivision of the Mennonites.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't know about the Lutherites, so I did look it up, and they say there's still a lot of them in the northern parts of America. Somebody studied about that, so right? On what issues did the Anabaptists differ from the magisterial reformers such as Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin? How did they differ from them? What incident gave the Anabaptists a bad name? What Christian groups today are the spiritual descendants of the 16th century Anabaptists? It's just recapturing it for yourself. I think it helps you to remember it. And then next time we will just compare it with what we wrote down. Thank you.